In the quiet English countryside of Millbrook, where rolling green hills stretched as far as the eye could see, lived a kind-hearted blacksmith named William, at 28. He was known throughout the village for his gentle nature and skilled hands that could mend anything broken. Every morning, he would open his workshop as the sun painted the sky in soft colors, and the sound of his hammer on metal would echo through the peaceful streets. William lived in a small cottage with his aging father, Thomas, who had once been a proud farmer. Their family had owned a modest piece of land for generations, growing wheat and barley that fed many families in Millbrook. But Thomas had a weakness that would change their lives forever. He loved to gamble. What started as friendly card games at the local tavern slowly became an addiction that consumed him, night after night. Thomas would disappear into the village, promising William that this time would be different. This time, he would win back what he had lost. But each morning brought new debts and fewer possessions in their home. William watched helplessly as his father sold their farming tools, then their livestock, and finally signed papers that put their land at risk. The debt grew larger and larger until it reached an amount that seemed impossible to repay. £500, more money than William could earn in 10 years of blacksmith work. The creditors were patient at first, but as months passed, their demands became more urgent. William worked longer hours, taking on every job he could find, but it was like trying to fill a bucket with a hole in the bottom. One cold autumn morning, a fancy carriage arrived at William's workshop. Out stepped Lord Thornfield, the wealthiest man in the region, who owned most of the land around Millbrook. He was a tall, thin man with cold grey eyes and a cruel smile that never reached them. Behind him came his wife, Lady Thornfield, dressed in expensive clothes but wearing the same heartless expression. "William Hart," Lord Thornfield announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed. "Your father's debts to my associates have become quite troublesome. £500 plus interest makes it 600 now." William's heart sank. £600 might as well have been 6,000. He wiped his hands on his leather apron and tried to keep his voice steady. "My lord, I am working as hard as I can. Surely we can arrange some kind of payment plan." Lord Thornfield laughed, but there was no warmth in the sound. "Oh, we have something much better in mind. A way for you to clear all debts immediately." He paused, enjoying the moment. "You see, we have a daughter, Emma. She needs a husband, and you need your debts forgiven." Lady Thornfield stepped forward, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Our daughter had an accident 2 years ago, a riding incident. She is no longer the same. No proper gentleman will have her now." William felt confused. He had heard whispers about the Thornfield daughter, but he had never seen her. The family kept her hidden away in their grand estate. "I don't understand, my lord. What exactly are you proposing?" "Marriage," Lord Thornfield stated bluntly. "You marry Emma, and all your father's debts disappear. Think of it as a business arrangement. We get rid of our burden, and you get your freedom." The words hit William like a physical blow. They were talking about their own daughter as if she were an unwanted piece of furniture. "She's damaged goods." Lord Thornfield continued with a cold laugh. "But a deal is a deal. Take her, and your debts disappear." William's mind raced. He thought about his father, now sick and frail from years of worry and drinking. He thought about their cottage, the only home he had ever known. But mostly, he thought about the casual cruelty in Lord Thornfield's voice when he spoke about his own child. 3 days later, William found himself standing in the grand hallway of Thornfield Manor. The house was enormous, with high ceilings, and portraits of stern-looking ancestors staring down from the walls. Everything was expensive and beautiful, but it felt cold and unwelcoming. His servant led him to a sitting room where afternoon sunlight streamed through tall windows. There, sitting quietly by one of those windows, was Emma. She was 25 years old, with soft brown hair that caught the afternoon sunlight like spun gold. Her blue eyes were fixed on the garden outside, and there was something in her expression that spoke of deep sadness but also of incredible strength. She was seated in a wooden wheelchair, her legs covered by a soft blanket. When William entered the room, she turned to look at him, and he saw intelligence burning in her eyes like a hidden fire, despite everything her parents had said. Despite the circumstances that brought them together, William felt his heart skip a beat. "You must be William," Emma said softly. Her voice was gentle but steady. "I suppose you know why you're here." William nodded, struggling to find the right words. He had expected to feel pity or awkwardness, but instead, he found himself drawn to the quiet dignity in her manner and the way she held herself with grace despite her circumstances. The villagers whispered cruel things when news of the arrangement spread through Millbrook. They said William was foolish to accept such a worthless bride. They wondered how he would manage with a wife who could not walk. But William saw something they couldn't see, a brilliant mind trapped in a situation not of her making, and a heart full of untapped dreams waiting for someone to believe in them. The first months of their marriage passed like two strangers sharing the same house. Emma had built walls round her heart so high that even the kindest words seemed to bounce off them. She expected William to wake up one morning and realize what a terrible mistake he had made. Every day, she waited for him to show signs of regret, to treat her like the burden her parents had always said she was. Emma spent her days in the corner of their small cottage that had the best light, surrounded by towers of books that William had carefully moved from her old room at the manor. She read everything she could find: mathematics books, astronomy texts, engineering manuals, and poetry collections during her 2 years of isolation after the accident. Books had become her escape, and her teachers. William watched her quietly, trying to understand this mysterious woman who had become his wife. She was nothing like what her parents had described. Yes, she could not walk, but her mind seemed to move faster than anyone he had ever met. Her eyes would light up when she read something interesting, and sometimes he would catch her moving her lips as she worked through complex problems in her head. He worked hard to make their cottage comfortable for her. Using his blacksmith skills, he built wooden ramps so she could move her wheelchair easily from room to room. He lowered the kitchen counters and modified their furniture so she could reach everything she needed. But more importantly, he began to really listen to her when she spoke. At first, their conversations were short and polite. Emma would thank him for his help, and William would ask if she needed anything. But slowly, as the weeks passed, their talks grew longer. William discovered that Emma had spent her years of isolation learning incredible things. She had taught herself mathematics so advanced that she could solve problems that would puzzle university professors. One evening in late autumn, William came home from work carrying the plans for a new bridge the village was planning to build across the stream that ran through Millbrook. The village council had hired engineers from the city, and everyone was excited about the modern design. William spread the papers on their kitchen table, curious about the technical drawings. Emma wheeled her chair closer to look at the plans. For several minutes, she studied them in silence, her finger tracing the lines and measurements. William watched as her expression grew more and more concerned. "William," she said quietly, her voice hesitant. "These plans, there's something wrong with them." William leaned closer. "What do you mean?" Emma pointed to the bridge's support beams. The calculations are wrong. Look here. They haven't accounted for the extra weight during spring floods. When the water level rises, the support beams won't hold. The bridge will collapse within a year. William stared at the plans, then at Emma. But these were designed by trained engineers from London. Surely they know what they're doing. Emma was quiet for a moment. Then she reached for a piece of paper and began writing numbers. William watched in amazement as she worked through complex calculations, showing exactly where the original design had failed. Her mathematics were clear and logical. And even though William was not an engineer, he could see that she was right. How? Do you know all this? William asked softly. Emma looked down at her hands. I've had a lot of time to study. When you can't walk or ride or dance, books become your best friends. I've read every engineering and mathematics book I could find. From that night forward, William began asking for Emma's help with his blacksmith work. At first, she was surprised. No one had ever asked for her opinion on anything practical before, but as William brought her problems to solve, Emma discovered that her years of studying could be put to real use. When the village baker needed new ovens, Emma calculated the exact measurements needed for even heat distribution. When farmers complained that their plows were breaking too easily, Emma figured out how to strengthen the metal without making them too heavy. Her precise calculations helped William create tools that were stronger and more efficient than anything he had made before Daughter's autumn turned to winter. Something beautiful began to happen in their little cottage. William found himself looking forward to coming home each evening, not just because Emma needed his care, but because he genuinely enjoyed their conversations. Emma's laugh, rare at first but becoming more frequent, filled their home with warmth. That had nothing to do with the fireplace. Emma began to notice something too. William never looked at her with pity or disgust like so many others had. When he looked at her, his eyes held respect and what seemed like growing affection. He would ask her opinion on important matters and truly listen to her answers. He treated her like her thoughts and ideas mattered. One snowy evening, as they sat by the fire working on a particularly challenging engineering problem, Emma realized something that surprised her. She was happy. For the first time since her accident, she felt useful and valued. William had seen past her disability to recognize the sharp mind underneath. William, too, was discovering something unexpected. He wasn't caring for Emma out of duty anymore. Somewhere along the way, he had fallen in love with her brilliant mind, her gentle soul, and her quiet strength. The woman his parents had called damaged goods was actually the most remarkable person he had ever met. For the first time since her accident, Emma began to hope that real happiness might still be possible in her life. Word of Emma's mathematical talents began to spread through Millbrook like ripples in a quiet pond. It started small, with William quietly mentioning to the village baker that his wife had helped design more efficient ovens. Then the baker told the miller, and the miller told the farmers, and soon people were talking about the young woman who could solve problems that had puzzled them for years. The first real test came when old Tom's mill broke down completely. The huge wooden wheel that ground grain for the entire village had stopped turning, and no one could figure out why. The millstones sat silent, and bags of unground wheat piled up while families worried about having flour for their bread. Tom had called in mechanics from 3 different towns, but none could solve the problem. The gears seemed fine, the water flow was normal, but something was preventing the wheel from turning with enough power. Frustrated and desperate, Tom mentioned his troubles to William when he came to have some tools repaired. Maybe Emma could take a look at it, William suggested carefully. He knew that many people still viewed his wife with suspicion and doubt. Tom was skeptical but desperate enough to try anything. the next morning. William carefully lifted Emma from her wheelchair and carried her to the mill. She spent an hour examining the machinery, asking Tom detailed questions about when the problem started and how the wheel had been behaving. "The gear ratios are wrong," Emma announced finally. "Someone replaced the main gear with one that's slightly larger, but they didn't adjust the other gears to match. The wheel is trying to turn, but it's fighting against itself." Tom scratched his head. But that gear was replaced by a trained mechanic from the city. Surely he knew what he was doing. Emma smiled gently. Sometimes the simplest explanations are the right ones. If you change this gear to match the size I calculate here, everything will work perfectly again. Tom was doubtful, but he had no other options. Within a week, following Emma's exact specifications, the mill was working better than it had in years. Word spread quickly through the village. The blacksmith's wife had solved a problem that had stumped experienced mechanics. Soon, farmers began coming to William's cottage with their own puzzles. Why were their crops failing in certain fields? Why did some areas flood while others stayed dry? Emma would listen carefully to their descriptions, ask detailed questions, and then provide clear explanations. She discovered that one farmer's crops were failing because he was planting them too close together, preventing proper air circulation. Another farmer learned that his fields flooded because a recent addition to his barn had changed the natural water drainage patterns. Emma could see these connections that others missed. Finding the hidden reasons behind everyday problems, William became Emma's partner in every sense of the word. When she needed to examine a problem in person, he would carefully carry her to different locations around the village. His strong arms and her brilliant mind formed a perfect team. She would study the situation and develop solutions, and he would implement her plans with his skilled hands and knowledge of materials. Their partnership grew stronger with each successful project. William learned to ask the right questions to help Emma gather the information she needed, while Emma learned to explain complex ideas in simple ways that William could understand and share with others. The real turning point came in early spring, when people noticed that the village church's ancient bell tower was beginning to lean dangerously to one side. The stone tower had stood for over 200 years, calling villagers to worship and marking important moments in their lives. Now it looked ready to collapse. The church council held emergency meetings. Most members wanted to tear down the tower before it fell and hurt someone. The cost of rebuilding would be enormous, but they saw no other choice. Father Matthews, the elderly priest, was heartbroken at the thought of losing the tower that had been the heart of their community for so long. When William heard about the problem, he suggested that Emma might be able to help. The church council was hesitant. How could a woman in a wheelchair save a massive stone tower that was ready to fall? But Father Matthews was willing to try anything to save his beloved tower. Emma spent weeks studying the structure, measuring angles, calculating wind loads, and determining exactly how much weight each part of the tower was carrying. She borrowed books on architecture and stone construction, teaching herself everything she needed to know. Finally, she called a meeting with the church council and many villagers. Standing in front of the leaning tower, Emma explained her plan. With growing confidence, "The tower isn't falling because it's old," she said, her voice clear and strong. "It's leaning because the ground underneath has shifted slightly over the years. If we add support beams here and redistribute the weight this way, the tower will stand for another 100 years. Many villagers were skeptical. How could a woman in a wheelchair save their beloved tower when experienced builders wanted to tear it down? But William stood firmly beside his wife, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "Emma's calculations have never been wrong," he said with quiet pride. "I believe in her completely." The project took months of careful work. But Emma's design worked perfectly. The bell tower stood straight and strong, its ancient bells ringing out over Millbrook once again, for the first time. The villagers looked at Emma with respect instead of pity, seeing her not as a burden, but as the brilliant woman who had saved their most treasured landmark. The test of Emma and William's partnership came during the harshest winter anyone in Millbrook could remember. Dark clouds had been gathering for days, and when the storms finally arrived, they brought rain like no one had ever seen. It fell, without stopping for 2 full days and nights, turning streams into rivers and rivers into raging torrents. The river Millbrook, which usually flowed gently through the center of the village, began to rise at an alarming rate. At first, people weren't too worried. The river had flooded before, and they knew how to deal with a little extra water. They moved their belongings to higher ground and waited for the rain to stop. But this time was different. The water kept rising, flowing faster and angrier than anyone had ever seen. By the 3rd day, the river had burst its banks and was pouring through the village streets. Families were forced to flee their homes as the muddy water rushed through their front doors, carrying away furniture, belongings, and precious memories. The village council gathered in emergency session at the church, which sat on the highest ground in Millbrook. Mayor Johnson, his stout man with grey hair, looked round at the worried faces of his fellow council members outside. They could hear the sound of rushing water and people calling for help. "We've tried everything, we." "No," Mayor Johnson said, his voice heavy with worry. "We've built sandbag barriers, we've dug drainage ditches, but nothing is working. The water just keeps coming." Old Tom the miller nodded grimly. "My mill is completely flooded. Another day of this. And we'll lose half the village." The council members sat in desperate silence. These were practical men who had dealt with problems all their lives. But they had never faced anything like this. The traditional solutions that had worked for their fathers and grandfathers were useless against this unprecedented flood. It was Father Matthews who finally spoke up. "What about Emma Hart? She's solved every other problem we've brought to her. Maybe she could help us understand what's happening." Several council members shifted uncomfortably. They had grown to respect Emma's abilities, but this was different. This was a life-or-death emergency affecting the entire village. Could they really trust their fate to a woman in a wheelchair? But Mayor Johnson was desperate enough to try anything. Within an hour, William had carried Emma through the rain to the church, where the entire village council and many frightened villagers had gathered. Emma listened carefully as people described how the flooding had developed. She asked detailed questions about which areas had flooded first, how fast the water was moving, and exactly where it seemed to be coming from. While others talked, she sat quietly in her wheelchair, her sharp mind working through the information. "I need to see the river," Emma said finally. "I need to understand what's changed." Despite the danger and the pouring rain, William carried Emma to several points along the flooded river. She studied the water flow carefully, asking him to take her to specific locations where she could observe how the current moved and where it seemed strongest. Back at the church, Emma worked by candlelight late into the night, covering pieces of paper with calculations and diagrams. William brought her hot tea and tried to help, but mostly he just watched his brilliant wife's mind at work, solving a puzzle that could save their entire community. By morning, Emma had her answer. She called the village council together and spread her diagrams on the altar table. "The flooding isn't just because of the heavy rain," she explained, her voice clear and confident despite her exhaustion. "It's happening because recent construction has changed the river's natural flow patterns." She pointed to her drawings, showing how the new bridge they had built the previous year, along with some expanded buildings near the riverbank, had created bottlenecks that forced the water to back up and overflow. We need to redirect the water using temporary channels, Emma continued. If we dig here and build barriers there, we can guide the flood waters round the village instead of through it. The plan was ambitious and would require incredible coordination. Emma wanted them to dig a series of channels that would create a new, temporary path for the river, bypassing the bottlenecks entirely. It would mean moving tons of earth and building wooden barriers, all while the rain continued to fall. Some people doubted that such a plan could work. How could a paralyzed woman solve what experienced men could not? But William stood up in the crowded church, his voice carrying clearly over the worried murmurs. My wife has saved our mill when experts said it couldn't be fixed, he said with quiet pride. She saved our church tower when builders wanted to tear it down. She's helped our farmers grow better crops than they've had in years. She can save our village too, but only if we all work together to follow her plan exactly. For 3 days and nights, the entire village worked following Emma's precise instructions. William coordinated the physical labor, organizing teams of diggers and builders, while Emma directed every detail from her wheelchair. Young men and old men worked side by side. Women and children helped carry supplies and tools. Even Lord and Lady Thornfield came to help, working alongside the people they had once looked down upon. Emma was everywhere, wheeled from location to location, checking measurements, adjusting plans, and encouraging the exhausted workers. Her wheelchair moved through the mud and chaos like a general directing a battle, her clear voice cutting through the noise to give precise directions, when the flood waters finally began to recede. Following the new channels exactly as Emma had predicted, Millbrook stood untouched. Her plan had worked perfectly, saving homes, businesses, and lives. 5 years after their marriage, Emma and William had transformed not just their own lives, but their entire community. What had started as a desperate arrangement to pay off gambling debts had blossomed into something beautiful that touched every corner of Millbrook and beyond. Emma had established a small engineering consulting practice from their cottage, which had grown far beyond what anyone could have imagined. People traveled from villages dozens of miles away to seek her advice on complex problems. Farmers came with questions about irrigation and crop rotation. Builders brought her architectural challenges that had stumped other experts. Even merchants sought her help with improving their businesses through better organization and mathematical planning. Their cottage had been transformed to accommodate Emma's work. William had built her a special office with wide doorways and lowered desks where she could spread out her drawings and calculations. The walls were lined with shelves holding technical books, and the large windows provided perfect light for her detailed work. Every morning, Emma would wheel herself to her desk, ready to tackle whatever challenges people brought to her brilliant mind. William had expanded his blacksmith shop into a successful construction business, building Emma's innovative designs throughout the region. He had hired several young men from the village who were eager to learn both traditional blacksmithing and the new techniques that Emma's engineering knowledge had made possible. Together, they created buildings that were stronger, more efficient, and more beautiful than anything the area had seen before. But the changes went far deeper than just their professional success. Their love story had fundamentally changed how people in Millbrook thought about disability and human worth. Emma had proven beyond any doubt that physical limitations did not define a person's value or potential. She had shown that what some people called weakness could actually be a source of incredible strength. Young people who felt different or overlooked began seeking him out for guidance and encouragement. There was Mary, a girl with a withered arm, who had been told she would never be useful. Emma taught her accounting and helped her become the most skilled bookkeeper in 3 villages. There was young James, who stammered badly and had been mocked. By other children, Emma helped him discover that he had an amazing talent for detailed drawings, and soon he was working as William's apprentice. Creating the technical illustrations for Emma's engineering plans, Emma would spend hours with these young people, showing them that everyone has unique gifts to offer the world. She taught them that what made them different often made them special, and that the challenges they faced could become the sources of their greatest strengths. The transformation in how people viewed Emma was remarkable. The Thornfield family, who had once mocked their daughter as damaged goods and tried to get rid of her as quickly as possible, now quietly sought her advice for their own business ventures. Lord Thornfield, who had laughed cruelly at the thought of anyone wanting his paralyzed daughter, now came hat in hand to ask Emma for help improving the efficiency of his estates. The village that had once whispered cruel things about William's worthless bride now spoke of Emma with deep respect and genuine affection. Children would wave excitedly when they saw her wheelchair coming down the street. Women would stop their work to chat with her about their families and ask for her advice. Men would tip their hats respectfully and thank her for all the ways she had helped improve their lives. Emma and William's cottage had become a place of hope for the entire community. People knew they could bring their problems there and find not just solutions, but understanding and encouragement. The couple had created something precious, a home where everyone was valued for who they were, not judged for what they couldn't do. One warm spring evening, as the sun began to set behind the rolling hills of Millbrook, Emma and William sat in their garden watching the sky turn brilliant shades of orange and pink. The garden itself was one of William's proudest creations. He had designed raised beds and specially built pots so that Emma could tend to her beloved flowers and vegetables. From her wheelchair, the air was filled with the sweet scent of blooming roses and the gentle sound of bees humming among the lavender. Emma reached over and took William's hand, her fingers intertwining with his were roughened ones. "Do you ever regret accepting their cruel bargain?" she asked softly, her voice carrying just a hint of the old uncertainty that sometimes still surfaced despite all their happiness. William turned to look at her, his eyes full of the love that had grown stronger with each passing year. "That wasn't a cruel bargain," he said with complete sincerity. "That was the greatest gift I ever received. They thought they were giving me a burden, but they gave me the most brilliant, beautiful, and courageous woman I've ever known." Emma laughed, the sound like music in the evening air. It was a laugh full of joy and confidence, so different from the sad, silent woman she had been when they first met. And they thought they were getting rid of a problem, but instead they lost their greatest treasure as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. William helped Emma into her wheelchair with the same gentle care he had shown her every day for 5 years. Together, they went inside their cottage, a home filled with love, respect, and the knowledge that together they could overcome anything. Their story had become legend in Millbrook and beyond, inspiring others to look past surface differences and recognize the incredible potential that exists in every human heart. They had proven that true love sees beyond limitations to find infinite possibilities, and that when two people believe in each other completely, they can change not just their own lives, but the entire world around them.